So to start, I would like to say, I would just like to show my book. So I hope you forgive me this little self-promotion. That's the book. It's very beautifully produced. I'm really happy. This is an art by Shara Sofia. So We Are the Goddess, which is kind of a result of many years of research and my own spiritual journey. So this is a kind of combination of writing that is very feminine in a way and masculine as well in a way, because it has researches alternative theories and Gnostic gospels about Mary Magdalene, but also tantric traditions of India, the classic tantra, and my own experiences. So it is a spiritual journey plus research. That's why I like to call myself a spiritual detective, because it is both. And that's why I chose to write not an well-researched, but not an academic book. So I could incorporate my personal experiences there as well, and maybe get a little bit more radical with this than, academic parameters would allow me. So because we are going to be talking about, for the Jungians here, I thought that I would pause and also ask myself this question: to which Jungian concepts kind of loosely this book relates? So I found a few. So one is the Dionysian impulse, which Jung defined as the breaking loose of unbridled dynamism of animal and divine nature. And I think this is what Eros is for me. And the book is largely about Mary Magdalene, Eros, and secret knowledge. The book also touches upon and discusses the different archetype of goddesses of Eros, and with Mary Magdalene at the center of it, but not only Mary Magdalene. And Jung took his concept of archetypes and he, wrote about it himself from another philosopher that I'm going to mention in this talk and that I mentioned in my book, We Are the Goddess, which is Philo of Alexandria, 1st century philosopher, when he describes archetype as expressed in myths as a specific stamp. I really like it, specific stamp that contains a revealed knowledge. And this is the secret knowledge aspect of my book that was originally hidden. And they set forth the secrets of the soul in glorious image. I love this definition, the secrets of the soul in glorious image. And then I touch upon at the end on the concept of shadow. And I will just quote one of his definitions by Jung, is that shadow is a tight passage. If we are able to see our own shadow, then the part of the problem is already solved. It cannot be argued out of existence. And I want to focus on this aspect of the shadow, that it cannot be argued out of the existence. And also the goddess principle cannot be argued out of existence, neither can Eros be argued out of existence. And at the end of this talk, if I have a time, I would like to discuss why it cannot be argued out of existence. So this is just as a way of introduction to some Jungian concepts, because otherwise I will be just discussing my own journey and the research based on the other goddess. So, and also at the end, I have kind of Jungian curiositas for you. So I hope you enjoy it, which I learned quite recently, only a couple of months ago. So I will share this with you. So if I forget about it, please remind me. Something that very few people know about, that comes from Jung's letters, that relates to our topic. Okay. So as we already know, because of my last name and because of my accent, I was born in Poland and I lived in many places, like many people nowadays. But I was born in a very strange place, which was intensely Catholic and intensely communist. So, I am very, I had a sense of, two very strong ideologies around me. So my book starts with me going to being faced with the first two archetypes as a little girl, which is one is kind of Dionysian and one is a kind of Apollonian. And I always found Dionysus, just a personal exposure, much more interesting than as Apollo, So this were these two archetypes. So I was going to a church, this beautiful Baroque church in my hometown. And there I had these two images of the divine feminine. One was of the Virgin Mary, this kind of very pure and what I thought very unrealistic representation of the feminine. And the other one, just to the side, was the representation of Mary Magdalene, which I always thought very intriguing. And I also noticed that she's somehow pushed into the shadows, that she's represented always very close and almost intimate with a relationship, in her relationship to Jesus, but somehow there was something really sexual and something that shouldn't be spoken about, and that it just intrigued me even more. So, but it was this strange kind of polarity of archetypes, because one of this was this kind of pure virgin, and I really had no interest in it, and the other one was this other more adventurous kind of archetype, which I later learned that, you know, was also very intellectual archetype when I started to read Gnostic Gospels, but then I didn't know about it. It's the archetype of a harlot. So obviously I couldn't relate to either of them, right? Because there's this polarity that I believe actually was planted in our collective unconscious, you know, about the feminine. Either this pure mother, completely impossible ideal for most women, for anybody really, or this kind of very desirable but somehow dark feminine. And I think that it really ruined our relationships. And I also discuss it in more detail in The Other Goddess when I talk about the marriage trap, the romantic trap, the erotic rapture, and so on. And if we have the time, I can discuss it, but it is kind of probably marginal for this talk. So we can continue in questions if people are interested in this topic. And I also speak about, you know, the difference between, for example, this free and the sexual alchemy and what it is. So I started to look into what most people start looking into when they look into archetypes. I started to look into the Greek mythology, of course. And I started to look for a sexually empowered feminine. And it was quite difficult because the sexually empowered feminine was really Aphrodite. Except that if you look into Aphrodite, she's a little bit like a Hollywood star. She's a little bit like Marilyn Monroe, which means, you know, completely disempowered at the end by her own powers, so to speak. So I found this hymn to Aphrodite, which is supposedly written by Homer. It's Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. And as I later learned through my research on other feminine archetypes of the feminine and Eros, she starts in a very powerful way, and then somehow something disempowers her. But we are not sure if she gets disempowered or perhaps it was edited out. So basically things are gradually edited. So all goddesses that as archetypes that are born and with powerful, wise, fully empowered, including in the matters of Eros, sexually empowered, wise women, halfway through each of his work suddenly get disempowered, and there are also sometimes linguistic differences. So basically somebody was working really hard on editing this empowered feminine. And the same happens in the hymn of Aphrodite. So she is so powerful that even Zeus is afraid of her because she can make him fall in love with everyone. And in fact, she makes fool of him quite often. And somehow, you know, right in the middle of the poem, the tone of the poem changes and she gets disempowered. She falls in love with some, you know, human being, and it's just one misery after another. She's humiliated over and over again. And I thought that's really interesting. And it somehow reminds me of the story of Mary Magdalene, but then, you know, I didn't go there yet. I will come back to this. So I started to ask myself, was there any other feminine that was sexually empowered in Greek mythology? And I found Circe. And of course, it's Homer again, and it's the Odyssey. And Circe is this powerful magician, really, you know, or a witch, although sometimes it has a negative connotation. And if you read the Odyssey, and it's one of my favorite works of literature of all times, you know, Odysseus is completely enchanted by her. So it's not like, you know, he was kept there by force. He says, Circe, my lady asked me to stay, you know, and she gave me a bath, and I decided that, you know, as long as she doesn't harm my companions, you know, blah, blah. Like he's completely enchanted by her. But I noticed that Circe, although she was allowed to be sexually empowered, she's always portrayed in a very negative way. You know, she turns men to swines, and men are actually really afraid of her. So it's quite interesting that the only sexually empowered archetype of the feminine in Greek mythology is something to be afraid of. And just to take a note of this. Also, she was quite possibly interested in what I call in the other goddess natural magic or lower magic, because I discussed that there are two forms of magic. One is higher magic, which is related to Mary Magdalene and the lineage of goddesses to Isis, and the other one is lower magic. Lower magic is basically playing with lower elements, natural elements. So you use one element to create something else. You sacrifice one thing to get the other one. So this is Circe. So I thought it's interesting. So she's sexually very alluring, but obviously extremely dangerous and dark, the way she's portrayed. And then I thought, okay, what about other mythologies? And because by then I was already a student of Tantra and I lived in Asia, I looked into archetypes. So for example, first of all, very traditional archetype of Hindu goddess Radha. And she's a very erotic, very sensual goddess that has a relationship with God Krishna, although she's married to another man. And it's a very erotic relationship. And I was thinking, okay, so how come she's allowed to have this really super erotic relationship with this very sexual god, Krishna? And it is because she's always longing for him. So she's always in this devotional and submissive mode. So although she's allowed to be in Eros, although she's actually completely forgiven for the fact that in Western terms, you know, she's an adulteress, it is because she's in a submissive mode, because she's very devotional. So you can be erotic as an archetype of a erotic feminine as long as you're being submissive and devotional. And that's not interesting to me. So then I looked to another goddess Sundari, which is not very well known in the West, Sundari. Sundari, so her full name is Tripura Lalita Sundari. She's the goddess of the three worlds. So she's the full-on wise sexual goddess who can move between dimensions, between different worlds in Hindu mythology, who is so powerful and who is so sensual, but then she loves mango trees come into spontaneous fruition and start to produce mango fruits. It's just too much, you know, she is just like full-on sexy goddess, but she's not just sexy, she's wise, she's ruling different worlds. She's ruling worlds of three different dimensions, not only, you know, this world, but two other worlds in addition to ours. However, quite interestingly, the closer we get to modern times, she also gets disempowered. So if you go to India nowadays, guess what is Sundari? Sundari is a name for different cosmetics and also for this kind of, how can I call it, massage parlors of dubious reputation, right? So there are Sundaris, and you know how unfair. So I think there's a kind of path for these goddesses that, you know, we allow them to be sensual only to a particular degree, or something happens and they get degraded somewhere. In the very same way that later I learned happened to Mary Magdalene. So I asked myself, was there ever Eros, you know, that was feminine Eros that actually led to liberation? Because after all, then I was already in Asia and I was studying classic Tantra. First, I studied classic Vedanta, which is the, you know, the mainstream Hindu scripture for several years. And then I started to study classical Tantra. Not Taoist Tantra, not Neo-Tantra, like it is understood in the West, but the classical Tantra, and I explain in a moment. And there I learned that there was this actually school of Tantra, which taught enlightenment through sexual practices. But it was not only about teaching enlightenment through sexual practices, but teaching enlightenment through sexual practices with a woman because a woman is considered in this tradition the necessary element. So the woman is conduit for the sacred energy, which is called, in yoga terms, it's called Kundalini, but in Tantra, it's called Shakti, for the energy moving. So a man needs a woman to awaken this energy in her, and then as the energy moves through the woman's body, it spills over to a man. So the woman is an absolute necessary for the enlightenment, so by using the sexual technique. So not only this, so I hope I'm not shocking everyone here, but also they worshipped female genitals, which is very unusual because in most cultures it's the phallic symbols that are being worshipped, including in Hinduism. But there they believed that the vulva is actually replica of a cosmic egg, so to speak. So, you know, the contraction and expansion is what happens to the universe, and that female genitals actually express that. So this tradition was started mythologically by a woman called Arda Triambaka. She was a daughter of a famous sage called Triambaka, and her name is half Triambaka, which means Arda Triambaka. And apparently it happened, you know, in very early stages of Hindu history in the Hindu Valley. This tradition was orally passed on from one woman to another. So it was a female tradition. So one woman passed it to another. They were called first yoginis, and then it was picked up also by Tibetan Buddhism later, and they were called the dakinis. And it was believed that dakinis not only carried on this tradition, but also they had powers. Or so that means that they could be, you know, in two places at once and so on. And sometimes they were actually feared because they had what in Hinduism is commonly believed that if you practice enough, meditate enough, and you work on your abilities, you can develop the siddhis. The siddhis, which means basically powers, right? So that can help you. So they were, some people feared them because they apparently had the siddhis, or maybe it was just a fear because, you know, they were powerful women. Now, this tradition stayed, it was an oral tradition until 10th century, when in 10th century, famous Indian philosopher who was like Einstein, Indian Einstein, medieval Einstein, he wrote his famous work, Tantra Loka, which is the light of on Tantras. So Abhinavagupta in his Light of Tantras included also very controversial chapter 29. Chapter 29 is actually describes the sexual practices for the purpose of enlightenment, in which he describes that women are, which is what I just explained a moment ago, so I'm not going to repeat myself because we have only limited time. I spent a year and a half of my life studying chapter 29 in Melbourne with a Catholic priest who is a PhD in Sanskrit and who translated it with the permission of a bishop. I went to a study group with him and with a Swami and a Tibetan monk, and what was Swami, Tibetan monk, and the scholar, a Sanskrit scholar who is a Catholic priest who actually wrote and published the translation of chapter 29. We had to study it for a year and a half because it is such a convoluted work. It was encoded on purpose because it was considered scandalous, and also they didn't want people who were not ready to perform this kind of ritual to perform it. So I basically used my academic work to pay my bills and spend all my time studying it with them. I mean, it was just a study group. Everything was very decent. You don't have to worry about it, but we try to decode what was actually going on there, right? Because it was written in a way that he translated it into English, and you read it and you still don't know what's going on, right? Because, yeah. So I try to simplify it in my book, The Other Goddess, and I explain also my own experience, because it just happened that I was already initiated to this tradition, which is a Kashmir Shaivism. So I went through initiation, and I spontaneously had an experience during a sexual act of the Kundalini movement. And I just spontaneously also fulfilled all the criteria that I later ran in the book, which one of them, and that's why it's partially scandalous, it is that this kind of ritual has to usually be performed not with your partner, but with someone to whom you're not particularly attached emotionally. So it's different from Western Tantra. Why? Because not that it cannot be performed with your normal partner, but it shouldn't be probably performed with your Western partner, because you are not, your sole focus should be on the expansion of consciousness, not about pleasing each other, not about all the baggage that our relationships have, not about whether we are going to be a boyfriend and a girlfriend after that. But that's why very often it was used only for very advanced disciples, because they knew what was at stake. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And I had the spontaneous movement of Kundalini energy, which, wakes up at your bottom of your spine, moves towards your heart, explodes. This is when it spills on your partner. I actually physically lit up. And then it moved to your forehead and then explodes again. And how do you know? And I'm just going to be very frank, because I gave about 30 interviews, in the last 3 months after the publishing of a book, and everybody asks me, who dares, how do you know that it wasn't just an orgasm? And my answer to this is because it was a conscious energy. It is like you, but it's something much wiser, older, and also a little bit different than you. You see this, you feel this conscious energy moving along your spine and spilling on your partner. Your partner is completely, fortunately, he was spiritually, aware, but, surprised to say the least. And, and then you experience expansion of consciousness that lasts for weeks. And actually, I didn't perceive reality as material, but just basically sparkles of energy. So I know that this exists. And that's why I set up on writing this book, because it's not just a theory for me. So when as I studied it, because I just for some reason had to study this, then I thought, okay, I really now have to seriously look into it and into other traditions. So in my book, I also give some kind of meditations that allow, because people say, what are you, single? So there are meditations from another word, Vijnana Bhairava, that allows for single people, they talk about, erotic rapture and so on. Just meditation on erotic rapture allows you to perhaps, because it's a gift. I still consider it gift of grace, because I wouldn't know how to repeat this experience, so I'm not a tantric teacher, I'm a spiritual detective, and I had an experience that I'm investigating. So when I thought, okay, so there is something that is, feminine archetype of Eros, and in fact, there is a tradition, a long tradition, which is also mentioned in another work, Mahatma Devi, which is 2,500 years old, where, Goddess Kali and Shiva, I can discuss it later if we have the time, the same tradition basically, but a woman is the conduit for the divine energy, enlightening energy, and that energy through sexual acts spills on a man. And this is how it works. However, unfortunately, just to close this tradition, since then, many male gurus used women for the purpose of enlightenment. And that's a well-known thing among all gurus. And I noticed it I belong to a community for 12 years, and it happened in my community. Fortunately, it had nothing to do with me somehow, but, and I was shocked when it happened, but there's a long tradition of gurus who use it because they know that, they need a woman for this, right? To have this experience of expansion of consciousness. Having said so, people also ask me, is it the only way? Of course, it's not the only way. What I'm saying, we're talking also in Jungian sense about a shadow. Eros is always used as a shadow and the mean, when I think that, Eros is a powerful tool for expansion of consciousness as well. So I pretty much by then thought that I figured it out, because I had this experience and, I had serious studies of classical tantra behind me. And then 2 men, so this is part 2 of my book, The Other Goddess, 2 men discovered something, made an archaeological discovery in Jerusalem and hired me to write a book about it. So it's a different book. And they took me to Jerusalem, and they took me to a church of Saint Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives. It's a Russian Orthodox church. And there, for the first time, I really saw this famous painting of Mary Magdalene when she stands dressed in red, stands with her hand extended with an egg in her head. hand, and she looks very royal and she looks very empowered. She doesn't look like the Catholic Mary Magdalene when, you know, do not touch me, right? Jesus says, and, you know, she's all penitent. And what struck me about this image, I knew the medieval legend. Where, you know, apparently this painting supposed to present Mary Magdalene as after the event of crucifixion, she went to Rome and to speak with an emperor. So, you know, powerful woman went to speak to the emperor, and he laughed at this, says resurrection is not possible. And she said, resurrection is possible. And just to prove it, this egg will turn red in my hand, you know, and it did. But I thought it was a naive medieval legend, which I knew, although there is some truth in it, and I'll discuss it later. Because as I was reading Joseph Campbell, Feminine Divine, he describes goddess Nimna, who is the Sumerian goddess, 4,500 years old, at least, as far as we know. At least this representation is, she's much older. And she's presented in a very similar way. And there's a lineage of goddesses that have actually the same symbol. She's sitting next to the tree of life of knowledge. Behind her, there is an upward serpent, which could stand in Hindu terms for Kundalini energy, for example, or in Gnostic terms for wisdom, right? Because serpent is actually a good symbol. Only in Christianity it became evil. Then on the other side of the tree sits a male figure, which is much smaller than her, that is representing humanity. And she, with her hand extended, offers him an egg or a fruit maybe of knowledge. And I thought, is a goddess offering us some kind of secret knowledge? And the same gesture, like Mary Magdalene in Russian Orthodox churches, goddess Nimna, the most, you know, ancient Western goddess, you know, that is not just a matriarchal goddess, but a proper goddess. Then next is the goddess Inanna. Goddess Inanna, it's a wonderful story. We don't have time to, but basically the same story. Not only she's involved in the process of resurrection of herself and her god and her lover Dumuzi, who's a young prince, you know, so the story becomes more and more similar to the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. She resurrects first herself because she's a very powerful goddess. She's much more powerful than him. And also she's represented very often with a serpent in her hand, which is called also Axis Mundi, which is supposed to be a portal between death and life. And it also represents portal between death and life, and represents also resurrection. Just and kind of like a transferring different dimensions. Then her high priestess Enjuenada, who is a historical figure, who was a daughter of King Sargon and became high priestess, she channeled apparently goddess Inanna and wrote these beautiful poems, and I have some translations in The Other Goddess, which are highly erotic, beautiful poems of Inanna longing for her lover Dumuzi. And this is the most beautiful erotica, you know, that is nothing sleazy, but on the contrary, most beautiful, but very sexual erotica about goddess Inanna. So then we are moving towards goddess Isis, and I realized we have the same kind of symbolism. Goddess Isis temporarily resurrected her husband, Prince, just long enough to conceive a child with him, right? To conceive Horus with him. So she resurrects Osiris to conceive Osiris. She is also the goddess of magic, including sexual magic, which was practiced in her temples, just like the temples of goddess Inanna. And what is higher magic? So higher magic is different from the magic, for example, that goddess Circe was using. Higher magic, which also exists in tantric tradition, because this is the parallel traditions, higher magic is not about taking one thing and creating another, because this is kind of Wicca magic, which is called lower or natural magic. Higher magic is having proper incantations in the name of a highest deity, that a form of mantras, I would say, in Hinduism or in Tantra, that allows you to go straight to the divine consciousness or to the divine mind and rearrange the matrix, so to speak. So something that is not working in the world and should be corrected can be corrected on the level of a divine mind. So this is goddess Isis. And then, we have Mary Magdalene, and the story is, so I believe that this is the lineage of goddesses. This is when I'm talking about the lineages of goddesses. Oh, and also goddess, I'm sorry, because I'm getting carried away. Goddess Isis is represented with Ankh, and Ankh is a combination, starts to look very close to what Christians did with the cross. It starts to look like a cross, except that it has a serpent across the cross. That's why there's this kind of, what becomes an Ankh, and it is supposed to be a portal between death and life, that gave her ability to resurrect. And then we have Mary Magdalene. And we have Mary Magdalene, who was present now, except that the goddess part is diminished in Christianity. We have Mary Magdalene. She's present at the moment of resurrection, but she's just there, right? She's not responsible for resurrection anymore. However, she's portrayed with the same symbols, about the other goddesses. She's dressed in red. She's portrayed with an egg. Sometimes she's portrayed with a skull, which has a tantric symbolism as well, and so on. And then, so I look, okay, so what happened to Mary Magdalene? Because for me, clearly, she's one and the same goddess, that she's resurfacing as an archetype of the same goddess that is resurfacing in our collective unconscious. And so I started to look into Gnostic Gospels. And I don't know if how familiar we are with Gnostic Gospels, but first of all, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was discovered before Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi was where the Gnostic Gospels were discovered in 1945 in Egypt. These are the Gospels, just very briefly, which were not included in the canonical Bible, because they were considered too radical in the 4th century. So what is there? There's the Gospel of Philip there, there's a famous Gospel of Thomas, and so on. There are many other, there are 40 Gnostic documents. And we can elaborate on this in questions if somebody's interested. However, there was another Gospel first discovered in about 50 years earlier, I think in 1895, which was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the most advanced disciple of Jesus. In fact, Gnostics believe that Jesus gave 3 levels of teachings. The lowest level of teachings he gave to the people around the Lake of Galilee, because they're simple fishermen and farmers. The second level of teaching he gave to his disciples, and the highest level of teaching he gave, depending on the source, either to Mary Magdalene or to Mary Magdalene and John, because he gave them his esoteric teachings. And in works such as Gospel of Mary Magdalene or Pistis Sophia, Gnostic's work, or in Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene, and many other Gnostic documents, Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the most advanced disciple of Jesus. In all of his Gnostic works, other disciples get jealous because Jesus gave her secret knowledge that he didn't share with them. The most angry man among the disciples is actually Peter, who is, of course, considered the founder of the Catholic Church. In both Pistis Sophia and in Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Peter says, basically, teacher, why do you even bother talking to her? Or in Pistis Sophia, he says it, and the teacher, which means Jesus, says, Peter, leave her alone because she is infused with spirit. In Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which the second part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene takes after the event of crucifixion, the disciples come to Mary Magdalene and ask her to teach them what Jesus told her, but not to them. And Peter loses it again. He says, why did he tell her all of these things and not to us? And Levi says, Peter, leave her alone. You know that he loved her more than us. And the same in the Gospel of Philip. Mary Magdalene is called koinonos. What does it mean? The intimate partner of Jesus. So obviously the part of Mary Magdalene is very significant in Gnostic Gospels, but also in Pistis Sophia, which is a very early Gnostic work. It is a session basically question and answers questions session between Jesus and his disciples, and there are 42 questions asked, and 39 of these questions are asked by Mary Magdalene. So she is the most prominent disciple there as well. In some Gnostic sources, also Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the representation of a Gnostic goddess Sophia, which is the goddess of wisdom, who also had erotic undertones in Gnostic cosmology and so on. So, so this is Mary Magdalene. I'm just looking at the time. And I would like to also add some personal research that I did on Mary Magdalene and the other goddess, if you don't mind, because this is really important for me. Because one question that I asked myself when I was writing the academic volume on spiritual travel, which was published in 2018, I think early 2018, because there's a long tradition, Catholic tradition, actually in southern France, of Mary Magdalene of going to southern France, based on the so-called golden legend. And, you know, it is a legitimate tradition. There are lots of, you know, even historical kind of evidence. But I asked myself, okay, even according to golden legend, if Mary Magdalene was really sent to France as a punishment, even according to the golden legend, she didn't go there until 15 years after the event of crucifixion. So I asked myself, even if she did go to southern France, which is quite possible, although I was extremely skeptical when I started my research, but, you know, there are chronicles and there's a long-standing tradition, you know, that it's not there for nothing. I asked myself, what would she do for the 15 years before she was kicked out of the Holy Land? And we know that all the disciples had to leave the Holy Land because they were persecuted. And I thought, you know, if I were Mary Magdalene, I would go to Alexandria, because she was an educated woman, she was a spiritually gifted woman, and it was a center of spiritual, philosophical universe, basically, right? Alexandria. It was also where all the Gnostics lived, you know, all the rebel kind of thinkers lived. But it was just an idea until I came across the work of another scholar, Johnny Taylor, who basically, not writing about Mary Magdalene, not writing about any of this, she said, oh, she wrote a book about Philo of Alexandria. Remember the one who was the first to define the archetypes that Jung mentions? Philo of Alexandria was a prominent Jewish, Hellenized Jew philosopher, first century philosopher, contemporary of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And in his work, Vita Contemplativa, his famous work, he mentions that in Alexandria and the surroundings of Alexandria, there was a group of philosophers who allowed women into that group. Now, we have to think that it is, so what, right? But in those days, it was what? Because women were not allowed much. But it was Alexandria, and it was a, you know, place, New York, London, Paris, you know, Milan, anything you want all at once, you know, just much better than the cities. And this is when the Library of Alexandria was, of course, and a famous academy and so on. So, and they said they allowed women, and they were called therapete. And the therapete were an interesting bunch of people, Philo says, because not only they allowed women who were spiritually or philosophically gifted, but they were also interested in alchemy. They were called healers because they were connected to the temple of Isis, and they also had connection with Gnostic groups such as Essenes in the Holy Land. And there is a legitimate research that shows that both John the Baptist and Jesus were connected with the Essenes, which is a group of Jewish rebellious group that didn't want to have anything to do with Jerusalem because they thought that the temple was corrupt. So they lived in the desert, and they didn't want to have anything to do with the Pharisees and so on. So I thought that's very interesting, I thought. If I were Mary Magdalene, and if indeed Jesus and Mary Magdalene, John the Baptist were connected with the Essenes, and the Therapete were connected with the Essenes, and And they allowed women there, and also they were connected to the temple of Isis, and there's an archetypical connection between Mary Magdalene and Isis, and there's also legitimate Catholic tradition that I didn't mention because I don't want to complicate it, that the reason why Mary Magdalene was considered, you know, a sinner was because she was of mixed Jewish and Egyptian heritage, but her father was an Egyptian who converted to Judaism, so the family was not completely Orthodox, and that he was connected to Isis. So there are all kinds of connections. So I thought, gee, so that's the spiritual detective comes to place. I thought, was there a woman in first century Alexandria that could fit with that description of Mary Magdalene? And, you know, just as a wild possibility. And then there was a woman that is mentioned by Zosimus, who is a historical figure, 3rd century alchemist from Egypt, from Akhmin, which is important, and I'll mention later why, who says that one of his biggest predecessors was a 1st century woman who lived in Alexandria, who was called either Mary the Jewess, Mary the Prophetess, Mary the Jewess because she was either Jewish or partially Jewish, Mary the Prophetess because she had some spiritual prophetic gift, or Mary the Alchemist because she specialized in spiritual alchemy, a little bit like Paracelsus. She was in spiritual alchemy, which means she was interested in the process of ascension and resurrection rather than changing gold into base metals into gold. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Right? So I check in the free resources of National Library of Israel, and indeed she was a historical figure, and absolutely, you know, Jewish people claim her, and there is some kind of even archaeological evidence of some kind of instruments from her laboratory. So she is a historical figure. Now I thought, okay, of course there is no proof that she's a Mary Magdalene, but I think it's a strong evidence because, you know, guess where Zosimus lived, you know, the man who actually told us about, the alchemist who told us about Mary the Jewess. He lived in Akhmin. Why is it significant? Akhmin is a city in Egypt. Why is it significant? Because the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was also discovered in a cave in Akhmin. So I think there was already a long-standing tradition there of her teachings. And when Gnostic Gospels, when the Gospels were rejected, because in 324-25, you know, the Council of Nicaea decided what goes to the Bible and what doesn't go to the Bible, you know, the Gospels had to be, you know, you couldn't have it, basically, right? You have to hide it. You have to, the other Gospels were dismissed. So I think it is more than just anecdotal evidence, you know, all of this. So this part of my book, that's why I wanted to speak about this, Mary Magdalene and the possibility of going to Alexandria. I consider it the most original part of my book, Via the Goddess, you know, and I'm very kind of detailed there, you know, how I arrived at this conclusion. With, you know, good sources like Philo of Alexandria and so on. So even if she later went to France, which is also possible, so at least for 15 years, she could have been in Alexandria, even if she went to France, although I think that her evidence of being in, you know, the possibility of her being in Alexandria personally makes more sense to me. You know, that would be a choice that I would have made, being, you know, who she was, I believe who she was. So I don't know how much time we have. I don't know what I should cover or not. I think we are almost running out of time, right?
No, feel free to keep going on.
Okay.
Joanna?
Okay. So I just wanted to ask myself also whether there were other women, just moving away for a moment from Mary Magdalene, in other times, you know, that were like Mary Magdalene, or, you know, were embodying the archetype of this, you know, a wise, you know, woman who is a bearer of secret knowledge and is also erotically empowered. So I'll just discuss very briefly 3 examples. So we all know about Pythagoras, of course, the famous mathematician, right? Who was also an esoteric philosopher, although most people just think about him as a mathematician. So it took the research, you know, of another scholar who looked into this, But Pythagoras himself said that his teacher, who taught him everything, was a Delphic oracle called Themistoclea. She was a woman and she was a Delphic oracle. She taught him of secret knowledge and esoteric knowledge he knew. Also, it is a now, a well-known fact, but, I'm talking about scholars, that his wife, Theano, was also a philosopher who ran the Pythagorean school with him, and she also ran the school after he died. And he always considered her his equal. There is also Diotima, and I'm just focusing on this three always. Diotima, who is mentioned in Plato's dialogues, especially in Symposium, when she gives basically a tantric lecture to Socrates on the redeeming power of Eros. Not, not just sexual Eros, but erotic Eros that, can expand consciousness in kind of tantric terms, if you know Tantra. So these women always were there, but somehow they were either hijacked or they were demeaned or called prostitutes, or even in feminist research from even like 10 years ago, or even nowadays, the sacred prostitute, which I think it's a complete nonsense. I'm sorry to say so, because these women were not prostitutes, they were not harlots, they were just completely misunderstood. So was the archetype of a goddess of Eros and secret knowledge. Yes, there were certain rituals, like in Tantra, in chapter 29 described, when there are sexual rituals for the expansion of consciousness, but that was not a prostitution. This is just a patriarchal misunderstanding of early fathers of church. And my master's degree is on Saint Augustine of Hippo, 4th century saint, one of the first fathers of the church, who lived in Carthage, now Tunisia, who still could observe the rituals of the goddess, and he called the goddess complete abomination in the city of God. These men were misogynists, and all were not misogynists, like Augustine. I love Augustine, I had the obsession with him for a while, a scholastic obsession, and he was a deeply sexual man, and he really struggled with his sexuality, and that's why they try to think it out of existence, sexuality and Eros. That's their shadow. And they try to, and they ruin our lives, and they try to continue ruin our lives, and I say this has to stop in my book. Jerome, who was a little bit older than Saint Jerome, who was a little bit older than Augustine, and who translated the Bible into Latin from Greek, he was a deeply sexual man as well. He went to the Holy Land, and he started convents for women, believe it or not. And he, in his own letters, he says that, if a woman shows a part of her body, it is just to torment a man. And if she hides her body from a man, she still torments a man, because he has to imagine what is behind the clothing. Okay. Then he says, I don't know what's going on. I'm sitting here in the desert and I close my eyes and I still see bare-breasted dancers from Rome. So they try to think Eros out of existence. It was their shadow, because for some reason, and we know you cannot do this. And I said, we cannot do this. There's nothing wrong with Eros. It is what we do with Eros is wrong. Because I do agree that how the way sexuality is portrayed in Hollywood, in social media, or everywhere else, that it is sleazy, it is sometimes brutal, and it is horrible. But this is not what Eros is. This is what we choose to do with this and how we choose to represent it. And it is a powerful force, as all tantric tradition of the West, by this I'm talking about the tradition of the goddesses I discussed, and in the West say, and it can be used or misused like every powerful weapon. And I think it's time that we stop misusing it and start using it, the way it can be used, to use this Dionysian impulse, what does it say? The dynamism of animal and divine nature. Right, so for the expansion of consciousness and to unite actually with the divine energy of a divine mind. So what I just also wanted to say that Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and I'm now quoting from my friend who is a Gnostic aficionado and who has a radio station in Chicago, Gnostic radio station, Miguel Conner, who knows everything about Gnosticism. And he said, and I went to his lecture recently, there's a very good scholarly argument that Jesus and Simon Magus, or Magus, Simon the magician, are one and the same person. Simon Magus is represented in a kind of negative way in the Bible because he's much more radical. However, like Jesus, he had a partner whose name was Helen of Tyre, who also, like Mary Magdalene, was considered the representation of Goddess Sophia, embodiment of Goddess Sophia, except that he was a very flamboyant and naughty man, unlike Jesus. So my friend Miguel Conner, I will just leave it with you, and I'll tell you why it is important to mention it, says Joanna, Mary Magdalene and Jesus are like the Beatles, when Simon Magus and Helen are like the Rolling Stones. But basically, this is the different edition of the same couple. So why I'm mentioning Simon Magus at the end of this talk, because I said that I will leave you with one Jungian curiosities here, because you know that in his, Carl Jung, in his memoir, said that certain curious character kept appearing to him in his visions called Philemon. You remember, in 2013. And in one of his letters, I'm not sure if it's 112 or 113, I don't remember from this lecture, to someone, he said, actually, it was Simon Magus. I called him Philemon. So I think it is a quite interesting thing with which I would like to finish this lecture, unless there are some questions.